verse. You know, how to, the book of Job, how should we think about God when disaster strikes? Can you have faith in God? Can you have a relationship with God? What's the nature of that relationship? Is it one based on blessing? Is that where our righteousness comes? See, a lot of issues to think through, and Job kind of presents the other side of the story from Proverbs, right? And how do we think about God? And how does God run the world? And how do we live with a God when disaster hits our lives? And that's the issue, obviously, that Job is going to address. Right? You got the brilliant young teacher, Lady Wisdom. We talked about that. We'll get to the middle-aged critic, Ecclesiastes, Kohelet. And right now, this weathered sort of old man who's lived life, who's experienced suffering, and this is, it ends up being the book of Job, right? And kind of as a philosophical, theological discussion, if you will, of how God runs the world. Does that make sense? So, all right. All right, good deal. I want to start with this. I know you've seen this before, probably, and I've done this in different contexts, but the prosperity gospel from John Piper, and you're familiar with maybe the idea, the concept of the prosperity gospel. I think it's alive and well in American culture, in the American church, in American Christianity, and it's sort of, it'll launch our discussion on the book of Job and the issues involved. So this is about a 2 or 3 minute video clip on John Piper talking about the prosperity gospel. Then when you see it, let's come back and I'll ask you, first of all, do you agree with it? And then I'll ask you, how does this issue bear on the book of Job? How does the book of Job deal with this issue or discuss this issue or think about it? Okay? And we'll talk about that. Are you ready? All right, here we go. John Piper on prosperity.
I don't know what you feel about the prosperity gospel, the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel, but I'll tell you what I feel about it. Hatred. It is not the gospel. It's being exported from this country to Africa and Asia, selling a bill of goods to the poorest of the poor. Believe this message: your pigs won't die. Your wife won't have miscarriages. You have rings on your fingers and coats on your back. That's coming out of America. People that ought to be giving our money and our time and our lives, instead of selling them a bunch of crap called gospel. And here's the reason it is so horrible. When was the last time that any American, African, Asian ever said, Jesus is all satisfying because you drove a BMW? Never. They'll say, Jesus can do that? Yeah, well, I'll take Jesus. That's idolatry. That's not the gospel. That's elevating gift above giver. I'll tell you what makes Jesus look beautiful is when you smash your car and your little girl goes flying through the windshield and lands like dead on the street. And you say, through the deepest possible pain, God is enough. God is enough. He is good. He will take care of us. He will satisfy us. He will get us through this. He is our treasure. Whom have I in heaven but you, and on earth there's nothing that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart, my little girl may fail. You are the strength of my heart and my portion forever. That makes God look right. As God, not as giver of cars or safety or health. Oh, how I pray that America would be purged of the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel, and that the Christian church would be marked by suffering for Christ. God is most glorified in you when you are most satisfied in Him in the midst of loss, not prosperity.
So first of all, do you agree or disagree with Piper's view of the prosperity gospel? Just first of all, that's just first of all.
Yes.
If so, why and where do you see it? And how prevalent is it? And how detrimental is it? David?
About the prosperity gospel, like one of my favorite teachers, his name is Justin Peters. He has cerebral palsy, and he has many seminars teaching against the prosperity gospel itself. And the reason why he does this was because when he was younger, he used to go to prosperity gospel churches, and they constantly prayed for him, they constantly anointed him, trying to heal him of his cerebral palsy. And one of the leaders, they were like, you just don't have enough faith to be healed. And I can see having faith that God will bring prosperity and wealth and all these things to you, but we again, as John Piper talks about, we make it an idol unto ourselves. Whereas we worship, and that's all we desire, rather than glorifying God, even in our deepest pain.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, so you agree with it? Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Steve. Josh, what do you think? I mean, do you agree? Is it prevalent? Is it dangerous? Is it?
Yeah, I feel like there's a stigma around it and saying that because you follow Christ, your life is easier. And I feel like that is something that secular people who don't believe in God often look at the church and be like, that's what it kind of shows, and that's how they kind of act. And once you get to know Him, everything in your life will be easier. It's no, everything in your life is going to be. You're going to be walking with God through everything that you do. So that is what it is.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, Lane's going to.
Yeah, kind of going off what Stephen said with because you didn't have enough faith, you weren't healed. I mean, that just seems like it's just diminishing God and the faith. Which God, it doesn't matter what your faith life is. That's not going to control God. It just kind of brings down God and nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, at least that kind of thinking, right? And then when suffering does hit, Christians, people in church, they get totally bent out of shape. I mean, I don't want to minimize suffering. I mean, my idea is not to minimize suffering, say it's nothing and there's no pain in front of that, but people get totally bent out of shape. Like, this absolutely should not be happening. What's wrong with, I mean, they turn to, God, or Job. What's wrong with God? He's not just, right? And all that kind of thing, right? So I do think it's prevalent. I do think it's dangerous. I do think it's unbiblical. I do think it distorts God and who He is and what our relationship with God is. And I think the book of Job is sort of a book that we can use, we can use to counter the prosperity gospel. It provides an alternative way of thinking, if you will. So I guess, yeah, go.
When we use the prosperity gospel, it almost becomes like an idol in a sense. He becomes like an ATM machine or something. You go to Him when you need Him for something,
Yeah.
and then when you're good, you just kind of, okay, I know it exists there, but I don't need it right now because I'm fine, and He's been blessing me. Oh, I just lost a family member. Okay, I need to go to that. I need to get help in that and this, whatever it is. And then you go back, oh, okay, I'm good now.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens, right? Yeah. Yes, Steve.
I would also think, just going off of that too, the prosperity gospel has, even though there's so many teachings against it, it's also such a normalized view in America and a lot of the Western church, whereas many youthful people, as soon as something bad happens, are like, God can't be real because my mother just died.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, probably, I mentioned a Pew Research poll done, it's probably old now, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago or so, surveyed non-Christians, you know, and asked them, what prevents you from faith? What keeps you from crossing a line of faith? And what keeps you away from God and the church? What is it that the number one answer, by far, above anything else, number one, was suffering. If that's the kind of God y'all have, I want nothing to do with it. If you have a God that allows drunk drivers to run over 4-year-olds, then I want nothing to do with that God. You know, and so, you know, the prosperity gospel, I mean, obviously Job's friends wouldn't call it the prosperity gospel, but that was their position. I mean, I'm asking you what, now the next question is, do you think this video, the prosperity, addresses any of the issues raised in the book of Job? The answer is yes. Which ones? What does the prosperity gospel, what discussion or issue does it raise that the book of Job also wants to talk about?
Like, you're doing a good job, so therefore you will have good things happen to you.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's how that highlights it,
Yeah, so the main, okay, I'm going to just give it away at the very top here. The main issue in the book of Job is it good? Actually, Job experiences trials, but he's not on trial.
No.
You know who's on trial?
God.
God. God and God's policies are on trial. And here's the main one. Is it good policy for God to bless the righteous? Is that good policy? Is the prosperity good policy? Right? Is it good policy for God to bless righteous people? Right? And what is the book's, and you know, that's the challenge, right? Because why? Because what does the advocate, or the Satan, the Satan, what does the opponent say about that? Is it good policy for God to bless the righteous? And Satan says, no, it isn't good policy. It's detrimental to producing real righteousness. If you keep blessing people, God, that's not real righteousness. If you keep giving people candy, it's not real righteousness. It's not real faith. Are you with me? Is it good policy for God to bless the righteous? Right? Satan says, no, that's not a good policy, God. And that policy's on trial. The flip side of it is it good policy for God to allow suffering to the righteous? Is that good policy? And so, you see, God's policies are on trial. Is it good policy for God to bless the righteous? Is it good policy for God to allow suffering to the righteous? And those are the things that are on trial, and they have to kind of work through. Does that make sense? The ultimate question is, what is real righteousness? What is real faith? And like in the video, and where it says, God is enough. God is enough. Can you come to the point where God is enough? Is God enough? Is God enough? That's the question, is God enough? Or are you in this for the blessings? Are you in this for the reward? Or is God enough? What's real righteousness? And put it this way, and we'll get into it. We're going to get into the book, but put it this way. What if, and I know because we as Christians now, we think about heaven. We think, doesn't matter how much suffering you have in this life, there's always heaven. There's always heaven. And that's going to be okay. Right? What if there were no heaven? I don't want to be John Lennon here and imagine there's no heaven. But for a minute, because that was a stupid song. But imagine there were no heaven. Would you still be in it? You know what I mean? Now there's the question. You said yes. But would you? The question is, would you still have faith in God without the blessings attached? Right? Thank you.
It also depends on how you define a blessing, because if God exists, and even if there wasn't heaven, He walks beside you every day of your life, and if you look back, you can see it. So I would define that as a blessing just by seeing that He was there.
Okay.
The fact that He is there.
Yeah. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. That's good observation. Because, I know. Because what God is inviting, I know, I'm getting way ahead to the end here. But what God is inviting Job into is a relationship. He's not inviting him into heaven. Christianity, faith, is not primarily about going to heaven. It's about a relationship with God. And that's what God is inviting Job into. And that is what the book of Job teaches is the most valuable thing of all. Even though it involves mystery. Even though it involves, there's no blessing road. Does that make sense? So I think the book of Job, it does address some of his issues. Is it good policy for God to bless the righteous? Is it good policy for God to allow suffering to the righteous? And so how God works in the world is on trial here. And that's what's going to have to be sorted out and thought through. Does that make sense as we go through this book? And actually, what the book addresses is not why is there suffering, because it never answers that question. The book of Job never, ever answers that question, right? God never does tell Job why he's suffering. Job never finds out why he's suffering. He never does. This book of Job, in that sense, and we use the word theodicy. The word theodicy is a word that we use to explain the reasons of God in the midst of suffering. Are you with me? Why is there suffering? What is God doing? That's what a theodicy is. The book of Job actually technically is not a theodicy. Because it never, ever, ever does address what is God doing in the midst of suffering. It never addresses why is there suffering. You know what the real question is? What the real question is not why is there suffering, but why is there righteousness? Why is there faith, and what is faith based on? It never does answer why is there suffering. But the real question is, why is there righteousness? And God is inviting Job into a relationship of faith without the benefits. And that's what real faith is. Does that make? So that's kind of where we're going with all this, and where we're going to end up at the end. So I've got way ahead of myself. But that's kind of what the book is doing. All right, everybody okay? Let's just do some introductory things here. I got a couple more video clips loaded up, and we'll watch those in a minute. So this book, I mean, this is a masterpiece of a book. A masterpiece. Because it addresses grand themes. Like what? Like grand themes like we just said. Suffering and faith, and how does God run the world? And is God just? And does God run the world by justice? You know what the answer is? God does not run the world by justice. And you're sitting there going, well, what the heck then? How does he run the world? I mean, I'm just paraphrasing Job and his friend. I'm paraphrasing both Job and the friends, because they both agree that God runs the world with justice. And God says, that's not how I run the world, primarily. God is just, but that is not the foundation of how God runs the world. And that's what the book says. Are you with me? Kind of? And you're thinking, I know, and then you're thinking, well then, heck! Then how in the heck does God? If God ain't going to run the world by justice, if that's not going to be the foundation of everything God does, then what in the world? Are some of you thinking that? Job was. Friends were. And Job had to find out that God runs the world not primarily by justice. He runs the world by wisdom. And there is a wisdom, I'm getting way, I can't help it, but I did all this reading over spring break, and when I was in Florida catching fish, anyway, reading about Job. But where was I? Oh no, I lost it.
Wisdom. About
Thank you, wisdom. There is a wisdom that is visible. Proverbs says so, right? Proverbs says, look, there's a wisdom that's visible around sexuality. And you ought to live that way. There's a wisdom that's visible around money. You ought to live that way. There's a wisdom around speech. You ought to live that way. You can see the wisdom. It's observable in the world. You can look at the animals. You can learn stuff from them, right? Ants and everything else. There's a visible wisdom that you can see. Proverbs says. Job says there's also a wisdom that you can't see. Life is much more complex than that. And God runs the world by wisdom. There's a higher wisdom that God runs the world by. And yeah, justice is part of that, but that's not the primary foundation of how God runs the world. It's wisdom. And that's what the book of Job is going to teach. And that's what Job's going to have to find out. Because Job and the friends think that God does and should run the world by justice. I found? In fact, there's a lot of people sitting in church pews today who think that God ought to run the world by justice. And they get bent out of shape when they find out that he doesn't. Or when they experience that he doesn't. You know what I mean? And in the end, we're going to find out that justice isn't everything. That's how Job and the friends frame the problem. But that's not everything. There's something better and more than justice. And that's what Job comes to find out, and we do too. That's the value of the book. Does that make sense? So these grand themes, suffering, faith, justice, how does God run the world? Right? And all that kind of stuff. And so and then exquisite language. The book of Job, what's the language of Job? I mean, what sort of genre? Poetry. Except for the narrative intro and the narrative conclusion. But the whole bulk of the book is poetry. Unbelievable, well-written, well-crafted, masterpiece poetry. This is some of the best written Hebrew poetry that we have. I mean, the Psalms are poetry, Proverbs is poetry, but the poetry in Job is just exquisite. Many of the words are rare words. In other words, many of the words are what some of you Greek people know, or language people know, as hapax legomena. What's a hapax legomena? A word that only occurs once. Right? And so you, wow. So it's got exquisite language and poetry and all of that. And then intricate structure. Yeah, Stephen.
And part of that also be because Job is just, like, it uses an older style of Hebrew.
Yeah.
It's written in older Hebrew.
Yeah, there is. Of course, although language isn't a way, I mean, yeah, there's old biblical and classical, there's old biblical Hebrew and late biblical Hebrew, but and Job's got a lot of that old stuff too, but other stuff, and it's hard to identify the date by language even with Job, but the poetry is the main thing. And then the structure. I mean, the structure. And we'll get into that in a minute, but just the narrative intro, right? And then the dialogue that goes back and forth and back and forth that makes progress. And then there's the silence of God. And what is that all about? And then there's the fourth friend who shows up, Elihu. And then what he adds to it. And then finally the Yahweh speeches, right? In 38, 39, 40, and so on. So, I mean, the structure of how this book is put together, we'll see that in a minute. But it's actually put together as a chiasm. Poetry and chiasm. So this is a masterpiece of a book. And just one of the best. I mean, where would we be in our faith and sort of the revelation of God without the book of Job? It would be much the poorer, right? We need this book. All right. Is this on the out? Am I following the outline now? I don't know what I'm doing.
You're there.
Okay, so let's just answer a few of these basic questions, and then we'll move on to some other things. So, the place of Job in the canon. This is, one of the best loved books that the Jews had. They loved this book. And this was a valued book. It, of course, was never in doubt of being excluded from the canon, anything like that, like Ecclesiastes was, like even Proverbs was, but not Job. And this was had just a prime main place in the canon of Scripture. Now this one. Is Job, so we deal with this issue, is Job the historical, is this history? Did this really happen? Is Job a historical figure? Did you read on or not? Did the textbook talk about this? I don't know. Wait, what do you think? I don't know. What I mean, it's an issue, right? What would you say?
Possibly.
Okay,
That's
possibly.
kind of what the textbook says.
Okay.
They gave, what, they gave 2 examples of like, an analogy to, like the Assyrian invasion. And there's another one towards like the Canaanites reign and rule, and it was referring to how the story of Job and suffering relates to those people during that time.
Okay. Or was it the Babylonian invasion?
It might have been Babylon.
Okay. So that, yeah, that's more related to
Like
the
an
date,
analogy.
that's more related to the date of the book? Like it was written in the Babylonian?
I can look.
Yeah, but anyway, yeah, Caleb, yeah.
In the textbook, it mentioned something about there being references of Job and Ezekiel and First John, James.
Good.
James.
James. Yeah, so there are references to Job in Ezekiel 14 and James, right? Stephen? Yeah, good, yeah. Then
Also,
Jason.
Jewish history talks about, like, connects Job to King Jobab in Genesis. And some of Job's friends are also connected to some of those kings in Genesis and Chronicles.
Okay. But that's Jewish history and tradition, it's not scripture, right?
Yeah, no, I'm just.
I know. So there's some people who thought, right? And Jason, yeah, add.
Yeah, in the textbook, they like, from my understanding, they seem to say that he was a historical man, but like the book of Job could be written more as like a parable, of like some sort. So like some life events could have been like real or dramatized or whatever. Because like Jesus also talked in parables. But they seem to say that they believed he was a historical man.
Okay. That obviously somebody somewhere experienced some suffering, right? And so on like that. But I think, the book, and I would come down with saying that this book of Job is really a book of literary art. It is more like a parable. It is more like a story. It is more like a discussion. For example, some of the things that would support that, that the fact that this is literary art or imaginative literature to discuss a philosophical, theological issue and policy of God. Yes, got it.
I forgot to look this up at the time, but quickly was reminded me. The name Job actually means persecuted.
Eov.
Okay, persecuted.
All right. Well, and perhaps that's why the author of this imaginative literature gave his character that name. Support his literary art. But some of the things that I think suggest that if we go in that direction are, of course, the speeches, the poetic speeches. Nobody talks in poetry. These are not transcripts of actual speeches. Are y'all with? No, this is poetry, right? And so these are not real conversations that took place between Job and his friends, and because it's all poetic, and somebody designed that and shaped that and put it into the form it is. Another thing is that what happens to Job are extremes. He is the most righteous person who has ever lived. And for the story to work, for the examination of God's policy to work, Job can't just merely be a righteous person. He must be the most righteous person who's ever lived. Are y'all with me? I mean, he is righteous to the extreme. And then the losses that he experiences are also losses in the extreme. He can't just be a person who has experienced a few tragedies in his life. He must be a person who has experienced the most extreme strategy. Tragedy. Sorry. Are y'all with me? So these are extreme cases to make a point. That's the idea, right? And then, even that scene in heaven in chapter 1, and then people go, well, does God make wagers with Satan? Is that what God does? Is that who he is? And I think we can't conclude from that vignette that that's how God operates and that's who he is. Because, by the way, it's not. That's not how God operates, and that's not who he is. Then you go, well, what the heck does that do in the introduction then? Why does God make a bet with Satan?
Verse 6.
Pardon?
Verse 6.
Verse 6? No, it's not a sitcom.
I know.
It's a sitcom. Yeah, I know. But even that scene, the wager, that's not consistent with God's character, but obviously that is merely meant to introduce the issue. right? I think that I think the author would say, what if we imagine that God made a bet with Satan and that God's policy of blessing the righteous was on trial? What if we imagine that this were the case? And I think that the author does that. So this is literary art, imaginative thinking, to sort of have that philosophical, theological discussion about the policies of God. Does that make sense, kind of? So, yeah. Yeah. Although, of course, real places like Uz are mentioned. Chaldeans and Sabaeans are mentioned. Job is mentioned, like Kaylin says, elsewhere in the Bible. But nevertheless, he could be mentioned in Ezekiel and James as part of the parabolic character of that character, right? And not making the case that he was a real historical person, right? So yeah, so there's that. All right, everybody okay? And then the land of Uz. One of the other things we got to think about in Job and in history is that Job definitely is a non-Israelite. He is a non-Israelite, which is, I think, important. Why is that important for the message of the book ultimately? Yeah, Lance?
I mean, most of the Old Testament is individual, so it kind of shows that the Bible isn't solely for Israel.
Okay, especially when it comes to this, right? Although this book is written to Israel, I mean, there is obviously the author of this book is aware of Yahweh and Israelite thinking and all that kind of thing, but Job himself is a non-Israelite. He goes through something here. Well, yeah, okay, that there can be non-Hebrew believers. I mean, Job is making sacrifices, but then any other culture outside of Israel would have also been doing that. So, I mean, the idea is that everyone experiences suffering. Everyone wonders about God's policies, right? And that this book is a way to, I think, appeal to, I think, believers and non-believers when it comes to this issue of suffering and so on. So, yeah, there's that. I love that. So, Uz. The date of the book, it's hard to tell. Is this next on the thing? Yeah, the date, I don't know. The date of the book has been given, a range from all the way from the very first book to be written in the canon, even before Genesis. Going all the way back to there, to Moses, even before that, all the way down to 586 BC, where this was a book reflecting on the suffering of Israel in Babylon. And why were they suffering? And what was happening? And why did God do that? And what is real faith? So there's a range of about 1,000 years there. It's hard to pin it down. We don't know. I mean, the way that the character in the book acts, making personal sacrifices, it seems to reflect the era of the patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But then again, that doesn't suggest that that's when the book was written. I mean, so it's hard to pin the date down, and ultimately, I guess that doesn't really sort of matter. The author of the book is an Israelite, writing to Israel, is aware of Yahweh, and all that kind of thing. So obviously, the author of the book knows about Israelite practices and all that kind of thing. All right, the purpose of the book. What's the purpose of the book? So the purpose of the book, I think, is to, on the outline here, how to think about God when disaster strikes. How do we think about God? How do we think about the way God runs the world when disaster strikes? That's the issue. The issue is not, why do bad things happen to good people? That's something to be talked about, and people do talk about that. That's a philosophical kind of theodicy kind of question, but that's not the question that Job addresses. The book of Job does not address why do bad things happen to good people. It's not. Bad things happen to good people. So how do we think about God then? And how does God run the world? That's the issue. Does that make? Okay. So that's the purpose of the book. So some of the subpoints there, it challenges the assumption that sin is always the cause of suffering. Obviously it does that, right? Job thinks that the retribution principle is the way the world works. The friends of Job think that the retribution principle is the way it works. And it turns out that the book of Job says that's not how the world works. Or that's not the foundation of how God operates in the world. The retribution principle is not how God runs the world. Because if it were, what would that say about God? Now, the retribution principle, everybody, what is that again? Yeah, righteous people get blessed and evil people get punished, right? Which is kind of what Proverbs said, even though Proverbs left room for mystery in that too. But if God ran the world by the retribution principle, then what would that say about God?
No mercy.
Right, Ken?
No mercy.
Okay, there's no mercy. Okay, there wouldn't be room for grace. That's true, right? What would you say about that?
It also feels that God's actions are dictated by man's actions.
Yeah. That God is subject to some external system of justice. Like the retribution principle, like, or as you say, a human theory of justice. And that God is sort of subject to that and must operate according to that, the rules of fairness and how humans have defined that and so on, right? And it turns out that God says the retribution principle is not how God runs the world. You know, so, yeah. The point B there is humans are limited in their understanding of the issue of divine justice. Humans are limited. It's interesting when you read the narrative introduction. The story of Job is introduced. There's two stages. There's two stages, right? What are the two stages? There's a scene in heaven and there's a scene on earth. Job has no idea what's going on in that other stage. No idea. We as readers know what's going on. But when we live our lives, like now, we are in the position of Job. Are you following me? And that is, we are limited in our understanding of divine justice. Right? But we know, because we're the readers, and we have been given sort of a purview of that heavenly scene, we know that God is acting. And we know that God has a purpose. Job didn't see it. We saw it, but Job didn't. So when we go through life, you know, we're in the position of Job. You know, if, just for a minute, if God had come to Job and said, look, Job, here's why you're suffering. I mean, this is what happened. I made a bet with Satan. You know, Satan said that you only worship me because I bless you. I said, no, you worship me just because of me. And that's what we're doing here. If God had said that to Job, what would Job have said back? Yeah, screw you.
Yeah.
Yeah? Like, not good enough. That stinks, God. I mean, that's ridiculous. You're playing with me? What are you doing? You know what I mean? And so...
Sounds like an irresponsible parent.
Yeah. Well, see, here's the thing. The book of Job is valuable precisely because Job never gets an answer to that question. If Job had got an answer to why he was suffering, it would trivialize the book, and no one would read it. You know why? Because I don't get an answer to why I'm suffering. God never tells me. So if God told Job, why in the heck should I read that book? Are you following me? But precisely because Job doesn't get an answer is what makes the value of the book so powerful. And the fact that we as readers are given a vision into the heavenly scene. We see that God operates. We see that God has a purpose. We see that God is sovereign. Then when we go through our suffering, we can know that there's something else going on. There's a higher wisdom in the world. Are you with me? I kind of think of it like this analogy. You know, like a parent and a child. Like when a parent teaches a child and says to their 5-year-old child, don't lie. Lying is bad. Don't lie. Okay, good, fine, that's kind of what Proverbs does, right? It says, don't use money this way, don't do that to the poor, use speech this way, don't lie. Is it ever okay to lie to save other people's lives? Yes. But how do you explain that to a 5-year-old kid? You can never do that. You can never do it. Because wait, Dad, you said don't lie. You said don't lie. And now you're saying it's okay to lie? What the heck's going on? See, as a parent knows that life is more complex and that there's more to it, but could never explain to their 5-year-old kid about the complexities of that and Corrie ten Boom and why she lied. You follow me? And that's kind of the analogy that God says, look, there's a wisdom in the world that's visible. Don't lie. Treat money this way. You know, if you do, you'll be blessed. If you don't, you'll suffer the consequences. And yet, it turns out that there's a higher wisdom that we can't see that is very difficult for God to communicate to 5-year-old kids like us. Does that make? And so we get bent out of shape. I thought you said don't lie. I thought you said righteous people get blessed. And God says, well, I did. But life's got more complex than that. And that's when we get the book of Job. See what I mean? And so human wisdom is limited. There's a higher wisdom with which God runs the world. Right? And we get that. Okay. Quickly, another purpose is what? C. God is free and beyond human comprehension. He is mysterious. Right? And we get that. That's part of that whole thing too. What else? D, the book examines the nature of the divine-human relationship. What's the nature of faith? Is faith based on blessings? Or should it be? Or can't? I know, good, you read the book, you're good. But what is the nature of faith, right? And would we trust God even if there were no heaven? What is the nature of our faith and righteousness? Are you with me? That's really the issue when it gets down to it. Right? Why do we worship God? Why do we follow God? Why do we have faith in God? Right? What's the nature of faith? And suffering, I think, brings that out and helps us think about that. So, in the end, at the bottom, God's justice is not the foundation of how the world operates. We said that. God runs the world by wisdom, and we must learn to trust God's wisdom. Does that make sense? And that's kind of what the book is. All right, everybody okay? How are we doing? Everybody good? Okay, now, having said that the book is not really a theodicy, having said that the book is not an explanation as to why good people experience suffering, having just said all that, I do want to spend a moment on the philosophical problem of suffering, which, by the way, is the issue that Job does not deal with. Did you take the philosophy class? Have you taken the philosophy tonight? Sorry. Well, yeah, I know. In the philosophy class, don't you talk about the problem of evil?
Yes.
A little bit? What's the problem of evil? And that's a philosophical problem. And that's a good discussion to have. And that's a theodicy, right? How do we explain the ways of God in the midst of suffering? The book of Job doesn't do that. But having said that, well, here's the issue. Here's the issue, right? Problem of suffering, the tension between power and God. If God is perfectly good, then he could not, this is the way the philosophical problem is set up. If God is perfectly good, then he could not tolerate the existence of violence, disease, and suffering. Therefore, since there is violence, disease, and suffering, there must be some limit to his power. Therefore, God is not almighty. I know. On the other hand, if God is completely powerful over everything, then he would act to eliminate suffering. And since he doesn't, therefore there must be some limit to his goodness. God is not all good and loving. This is the way people approach it, non-Christians and so on, others, and they do that. So they take the goodness of God, the power of God, and since there's evil and suffering, what people will do to solve this tension is what? To solve this tension between an all-powerful God and an all-good God, but yet they're suffering evil. What do people do to solve that tension?
Diminish one or the other.
Exactly. Reduce one or the other and say, well, God's not all good, God's not all powerful, that's why they're suffering in evil. Right? And so now here's the thing. The tension is there especially for Christians. I mean, non-Christians kind of go, oh, all right, God's not all powerful. All right, God's not all good. But for Christians, me, I don't want to reduce this one, and I don't want to reduce this one. And I'm left with this. So what do? I'm just left with more tension and more angst than anybody else. Are you with me? And that's sort of the issue. The issue just gets sharpened for Christians. Maybe you're familiar with this book, are you? By a rabbi, it's a classic. It's a classic. By a rabbi, it's a Jewish rabbi, Rabbi Harold Kushner, When Bad Things Happen to Good. It's a classic book. And you know, it's a good book, it's worth reading. But his solution is what in the book? Has anybody read this book? No, you should. Yeah. You know what his solution is? God is not all powerful. That's what he does. That's his solution. So I was telling you, there are non-Christians, even Harold Kushner reduces God's power. The thing that I think people who think this way haven't factored in is this. What if God has morally good reasons for permitting suffering? Well, then we can maintain this and we can maintain that and not reduce either, and yet there can be suffering around. Does that make? What if God has good moral reasons for allowing suffering? And I don't think people factor that one in. And of course, then the issue comes, well, what is a good reason? What is a good moral reason? I mean, that's a whole other talk, right? But yeah. What if God has good reasons? Does that make? Are you following all this? So that's the philosophical problem, the way it gets set up, and all of that. If you remember Bart Ehrman, okay. Can historians prove that, his whole thing is to debunk Christianity and all that now in the Bible. Can historians prove that Jesus was raised from the dead? I always argue that no one can prove it. Although apparently, you can. It's maybe the most provable thing about Christianity of all. Yeah, because there's witnesses and evidence. And according to William Lane Craig, there's a mathematical formula. So anyway, are the gospel accounts of Jesus reliable? No, not completely. Does the Bible provide an adequate answer as to why there is suffering? No, not really. So you see, this is an issue for a lot of people, including Bart Ehrman. All right, you want to, I know, again, the book of Job does not address the logical problem of suffering. The philosophical, it does not, right? But having said that, we're in that now. Are you familiar with William Lane Craig? Do you know William Lane Craig? Okay, philosopher, theologian, William Lane Craig. I think he's got an organization, Reasons to Believe, or
Reasonable faith.
Reasonable Faith, yes, sorry. Thank you. Reasonable Faith, and videos, articles, you don't like it. Here's William Lane Craig on the logical problem of evil. See what you think, and we'll talk. And just what we've been talking about, and the way they present it, I think maybe make it understand. Here it is. I'm not sure how long it is, but here it is.
We are all well aware of the suffering and evil in the world. Horrific suffering, unspeakable evil. How then can anyone believe in the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God? And if God does exist, why would anyone want to worship Him? Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this. If God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, then He's not all-powerful. If He is able to prevent evil, but not willing, He is not good. But if He is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if He is neither able nor willing, then why call Him God? In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not. Is this a good argument? Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent? No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements. David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements. So there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that will bring out the alleged contradiction. Here they are. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. And if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist. Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist. But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true? Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world he wants? What if he wants a world populated by people who have free will? It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good. Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible. It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense. So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good. So the first assumption is not necessarily true. Therefore, the argument fails. And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this? We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true. For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. This burden of proof is too heavy to bear. It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist. This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of a theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
But this is hardly the end of the discussion. We still need to explore the probability version of the problem of evil.
Okay, did you kind of follow that? I mean, I said it before, and God's all good, God's all powerful. If you maintain those two, how can there be suffering and evil? But what if God has morally good reasons? So, you know, that's the logical way of addressing the problem of evil. And then then he's got the probabilistic. Okay, if the logical argument can't be proven true, then it's probable that God wouldn't exist with suffering and evil. And that's a whole other discussion that I'm not going to show you that video. Here's William Lane Craig, though, on the intellectual and emotional problem of suffering. There's the logical problem, but then there's the emotional problem. So listen to how William Lane, this is him now, this is William Lane Craig himself. Look at it. And this is he talking about the emotional problem. Here it is.
Well, in this session, I want to deal with this question with you. And in handling a topic that is emotionally as loaded as this one is, I think it's really important that we make a number of distinctions to keep our thinking about it clear. So first of all, I think we need to differentiate between the intellectual problem of suffering and the emotional problem of suffering. Do we have a diagram of that? Yes, here we go. The intellectual problem of suffering concerns whether it's plausible to think that God and suffering in the world can coexist. What is the rational account of the compatibility of God and suffering? The emotional problem of suffering concerns people's dislike of a God who would permit terrible suffering. And I think it's very important that we keep these two versions of the problem distinct, because the answer to the intellectual problem is apt to appear dry and uncaring to the person who's really suffering emotionally as a result of the suffering in the world. On the other hand, the answer to the emotional problem is apt to appear superficial and unsatisfactory to someone who's contemplating it as a purely philosophical question. Now, I'm convinced that for most people, the terrible suffering in the world is not really an intellectual problem, but an emotional problem. I think that their unbelief is born not out of reputation, but rather simply out of rejection. They just don't like a God who would permit them or others to suffer terribly, and so they just want nothing to do with them. But in order to support this claim that the problem of suffering is really an emotional problem, we need to examine in some detail the intellectual problem of suffering in order to show that it fails as a disproof of the existence of God.
So he's distinguishing between the intellectual problem, the logical problem, and the emotional problem, right? The logical problem is the previous video that you saw. Can God and suffering coexist? Logically. And then there's the whole discussion around that, right? And then he has that, I don't know if you saw that on the one side, is the probable. Okay, it's not logically impossible, but it's improbable. So that both comes under the intellectual. Then there's the emotional problem, where people don't struggle with the logical consistency of God and suffering, but they just don't like a God who acts this way. Right? That's closer to the book of Job. Job does not deal with the intellectual problem and philosophical problem and answer why suffering can they coexist. But the emotional problem is closer to Job, because Job himself doesn't like a God who operates this way. In fact, he thinks God is unjust, and he doesn't like it when God acts this way. Are you following me? So there's the intellectual problem, there's the emotional problem, and the emotional one is closer to the book of Job. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Everybody okay? All right. Now, yeah, Jason.
So he said that the emotional problem was like people who claim that they're in God because they're rejecting God, not because they're disbelieving in Him. But
they just don't like him.
Right. So then, in Job's case, he never rejected God. So what was he rejecting? Was he rejecting something then?
He wasn't rejecting anything. He was accusing God of being unjust.
Okay.
That's what Job's doing in the book. We're going to get. I'm going to explain. Job is accusing God. See, Job believes in the retribution principle. Right? He believes in that. That's the way God operates the world. But Job knows he's innocent. So what's the conclusion that he comes to? God operates by retribution. I'm innocent, but now I'm suffering. And so his conclusion is, God's not just. Are you following me? On the other hand, the friends also believe in the retribution principle, but they believe that God is just. And so their conclusion is, Job's not innocent. You see? I have a triangle coming up that will explain all these relationships and all that. But for now, some of the different answers that have been given to the problem of evil and suffering, that is the theodicy. How do we explain suffering in the world? Let me show you some of the inadequate answers that have been given, both philosophically, then even some Christian answers that I think are also insufficient. So one of them is dualism. Am I in the outline now? What's dualism? What's dualism? What's dualism?
This one?
And this explains the problem.
Nope.
Am I in the outline? Yeah, so dualism, right, is that there are equal powers of good and evil. And they're kind of duking it out, and that's why there's evil sometimes. And that's why there's suffering. Because you got two equally powerful things that are duking it out. That's dualism. I think dualism fails on two counts. That is, number one, you cannot accept two mutually independent beings as self-grounded and absolute. There can't be two equally powerful, independent, self-grounded, absolute. One must be derivative of the other. This is the critique of dualism. And then the second critique is dualism gives evil a positive nature. I mean, if they're both equal, then in what sense is one right and one wrong? Then it's just arbitrary, right? So in what sense is good, and evil, evil? If they're two equal ones, then that gives evil sort of a positive nature. Did you follow that argument? Sort of? So there can't be two. One must be derivative of the other. Evil is parasitic of good. Good is the absolute. Evil is derivative of that. They can't be like this. They must be like this. Does that make sense? So this is an inadequate way of explaining why there's suffering. Dualism doesn't work. That's all I'm saying. Another one is deism. All right, what's deism? What's deism?
God created the world, and after the creation, he just left it.
Yeah.
It's on course.
Yeah, God wound up the clock and took off and said, "Wake me up when it's over." And so this is the popular view of Western culture. Our culture. Well, there's a God. He just got nothing to do with our life and our world. We're on our own, man.
Just not, though. I also think of it as the investment that he just left behind. So
Yeah.
for when he comes forward and matures, I don't know, sooner than later.
Yeah, well, exactly. Right. How would you critique deism? Right. Our Western culture thinks that God is remote, God is distant, God is sleeping, so some things get past him, and that's why there's evil and suffering. Right? How would you critique that? Yeah.
He has been his son in order to suffer for us. I don't know what a better name is.
Read the Bible. God's not remote. God's not distant. He invites people into personal relationships and so on like that. Yeah, it's good.
It was written in the sense of brother and family, and that God has our characteristics, and not like we have tools.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So it ends up being a practical atheism, right? And you believe there's a God, but he's nothing to do with our life. So I think our culture basically lives this way, right? This is our Western culture. We live with we don't, but our culture, I don't. Yeah. So deism is. Pantheism is another ism. All the other isms and isms. Everything has an ism is bad. If it ends in ISM, it's bad. Science is good, scientism is bad. Right? Put an ISM at the end, it's bad. Pantheism goes like this. All is God, God is good, therefore all is good. And it just denies the problem of evil. This is basically the Christian Science movement. Right?
Isn't that also I don't know if it's the right ism, but where everything has a bit of God in it?
Yeah, pantheism. Yeah, everything. World, creation, right? So pantheism. God is finite and limited. This is another theodicy, a way of answering the philosophical question, right? God limited. And this was the answer of Krishna, which we said, right? And this is one that people frequently use too. They're like, God's busy, he can't do everything. He's busy. He's not all powerful. I mean, it's kind of an ancillary argument of the dualism, that God somehow is limited. Karma, right? That, you just get another chance, right? And that explains you're punished for what you did in this life and you get another life. Well, the retribution principle still stands, right? You're still punished and something like that. So karma is not a good explanation either. Then the more Christian answers that I think are also inadequate. Approaches to evil and suffering and so on like that, which the book of Job would not advocate. One is piety. What's piety? What's piety? Okay, when there's evil and suffering, just the answer is to be pious. What's got it? Want to give it a shot?
If I remember correctly, piety is usually maintenance of good character, moral character, following precepts.
Okay.
But it's more so walking following.
Yeah. It's mostly going through rituals. I mean, making sure that you cover all your bases, make sure you pray, make sure you go to church, and make sure you give your offering, right? And, I mean, there's nothing, and make sure you do devotions and pray. I mean, piety can be good, right? Piety is good, right? When we do offer these things to God, but then piety is when suffering hits, you get these stupid pious cliches. Well, like I had in my sermon, did I say this? I didn't say it, but I'm quoting something else. Well, when God closes the door, He opens the window. Didn't I say that much?
Mm-hmm.
You ready? Okay, shut up. Or, well, life goes on. Well, praise God. You ever read? Oh, praise God. Praise God. And it's just pious. That's not Job's answer either. Because if you read the book of Job, how does Job respond to his suffering and his relationship with God? He's pissed off, to put it lightly, right? He yells at God. He accuses God of being unjust. He accuses God of being remote. He accuses God of being petty. So that's not pious. So piety, that just sort of is a way of avoiding everything, right, in the Christian community. And don't you see that a lot with Christians in the church? When suffering happens, well, it's not our job to question God. It's not our job, right? We just got to keep praying and going to church. Everything will be all right. It's like, no, you're not dealing with anything. That you don't even have an understanding what faith is, if that's where you operate, right? So, piety is one. How about this? This is a popular one. Very popular in evangelical Christian circles. Postpone everything. Well, there's suffering. Well, after all, I'm going to heaven. So, I'm okay. Well, how would you critique this one? Yeah.
I mean, it feels almost nihilistic. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't matter. Like your suffering doesn't matter, your joy doesn't matter. All that matters is really getting to heaven.
Yeah. So you're not really dealing with your suffering here and now, right? And a relationship with God now. If you read the book of Job, nowhere in the book of Job does it talk about afterlife. Now it does talk about Sheol, right? Going to Sheol, but Sheol wasn't heaven. And by the way, it wasn't hell either. It was kind of a shadowy existence where people are. It's kind of like the waiting room, or I don't know. Later on, Judaism and certainly Christianity, obviously, developed ideas more of the more developed ideas of the afterlife. But not the book of Job. The book of Job nowhere talks about, well, after all, in the end, you're going to heaven. So whatever, right? The book of Job deals with what is God's justice and how is God operating the world now? How do I deal with my suffering now? And how do I relate with God now? Are you with me? The book of Job in no way postpones everything to heaven. Never. Does that make sense? No, I know. I mean, again, in the evangelical community, we think the whole ball of wax is what? Going to heaven. Right? Going to heaven. Well, Jesus died on the cross, forgave my sins, so I can go to heaven. And I'm not going to hell. And I think that's a very shallow, if you will, understanding of faith and Christianity in a relationship with God. And I think the book of Job invites us into a deeper, more real understanding of faith and what is righteousness and what it means to have a relationship with God. Not for the benefits, but for just God Himself. Does that make? And I think if there was no heaven, it makes us think about that. And then finally, we'll just end with this one, I guess, and we'll pick it up here on Monday or something. But discipline. So in the Christian community, people will also suggest that suffering is what? And this is the way they would explain it, right? This is their sort of theodicy and explanation. They would say what? Well, after all,
God disciplines those he loves.
yeah, this is God's discipline in your life. There's a lesson that God wants to teach you that's difficult for you to learn, and this is what God is doing to teach you. Or this is his punishment for what you did, or you know, this. No, I'm not saying it's right, but this is what Christians will say, right? The pious explanation, the folks want everything to heaven explanation, or the discipline explanation. Now wait a minute. Wait a minute. This one is close because it sounds like Hebrews. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children, for what children are not disciplined by their father. If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters. Wait a minute. Whoa, maybe that is right. Maybe that is right. What would you say in response? I know now it's 2:20 and I'm going to leave, but...
I lost my legs, that doesn't feel like discipline.
Well, yes, does God discipline? Yes. Yes, he does. But there's no way in the world that you could ever know that's what's happening to somebody else's life. There's no way. There's no way.
I mean, even the Book of Job introduces Job as having an upright and righteous character.
Yeah.
So he's without, you know.
Yeah, and that's the whole point of the book. We're almost done here. We're almost done. I mean, this is Job 5. We're almost done. This is Eliphaz, the first friend. This is what he suggests as a remedy. Blessed is the one whom God corrects, so do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. Unfortunately, this is an explanation that is rampant in the Christian community. This is God's discipline in your life. Oh, you haven't read the book of Job. You're acting like Job's knucklehead friends. And you're not helping. In fact, you're hurting. Does that make sense? So these are some of the explanations that have been given, some inadequate ones, some Christian inadequate ones. And again, the book of Job is dealing with the policies of God. Is it good policy to bless the righteous? Is it good policy to allow suffering to the righteous? And does God operate the world by justice? And so, yeah, the answer to that is no. And we'll figure out what true faith is. Does that make sense, everybody? Are you all, at least, did we get our feet wet today a little bit? All right, our feet are wet. We'll go on from here on Monday. The assignments are up, the reading is up for next week, so hop into that and do what you can with that. Then we'll come back. I'll readjust the date for the Job paper, and we'll discuss that on Monday. Is that satisfactory? All right, thanks everybody. Have a